What is up, everybody, and welcome to the All-NBA podcast, part of the All-City Podcast Network. We got a great show lined up for you today. We're going to talk a little bit about the Raptors beating the Suns. The Clippers have a bounce-back win over the Sacramento Kings. Two very impressive wins for teams that desperately needed impressive wins. It's Thursday. We're going to do a little Throwback Thursday. We're going to look at the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. Ask Tim Legler what made those decades good in basketball. Can't wait for that conversation. To help me, the star of the show, Tim Legler. Tim, what's going on?
What's up, Adam? I'm good, man. Looking forward to that decades conversation that basically covers my entire life in basketball. I didn't really take up the sport until around 1980 or so. So it's going to be an interesting discussion, man. I can't wait to get into that.
I'll be honest, I didn't know if I should throw the 70s in there. I was like, I don't know if 70s is going too far back.
I mean, technically, I was around, but I didn't really follow basketball at all until I hit a growth spurt going into high school, and I decided, hey, this looks like a fun game. Let me try this.
Right. All right, so we're going to get into all those things, but first, got to tell you, we're presented by DraftKings Fantasy Sports. Check out DraftKings has to offer this season using promo code ALLNBA because life's more fun when you're in on the action. DraftKings, the crown is yours. If you have a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Age and eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. See DraftKings.com for details. All right, the game we want to start out with, the Suns visiting the Toronto Raptors up north, and the Toronto Raptors put on a nice defensive clinic against them. They get the win 112-105. Devin Booker shoots just 2 of 12 from the field. Kevin Durant takes 30 shots, goes 11 for 30. But the Toronto Raptors were able to kind of put the clamps on. What stood out to you in this one, Legs?
Well, I think the first thing that stood out to me in watching this game is I just don't understand how Toronto's 9-10. They don't have a 9-10 roster. They have a much better roster than that. Maybe some people would disagree, but when I see this team and I see all the versatility with their wings and the length of their wings and what they're capable of defensively, and they've got shooting as well, a very serviceable center. They don't have traditional lead guard play. Dennis Schroeder's a very good player, but he's not a guy that's like an organizer or set the table guy. He's a scorer more than anything else. So maybe they're lacking a little bit there. But when I look at the rest of this roster, it doesn't make sense to me. And I saw a lot of the reason I like them so much in this game last night because I think their length and activity level really bothered the Phoenix Suns and their ability to get space and get shots. And it wasn't just, Durant had an off night or Booker had an off night. There's a reason they had off nights, that the space was disappearing. The length was bothering them. Yeah, of course, you're always going to get on nights like that. Yeah, we can go point to a handful of open looks, and Durant missed a couple of bunnies in the last 6 minutes that would have helped them a lot. Yeah, I agree with that. But when you look at the totality of the possessions and the diligence that Toronto was putting into the defensive end of the floor, you're going, well, how is this team 9-10, particularly in the East? I mean, there's a spot to be grabbed beneath those top three. And we're all trying to figure out, like, who is that going to be? Is it the Knicks? Is it the Heat? It could be the Raptors eventually. So I'm going to be honest. You got to cover the whole league, Adam. I haven't seen a ton of Toronto Raptors yet this year, but I've seen them in bits and pieces. And then I watched the entire game last night, and I was so impressed with their activity level and their defensive energy and the versatility of these guys. So that's the first thing that stood out. Like, wow, how are they under 500, 6 weeks into the season?
So you texted me that this morning as sort of one of the things you're thinking about as you're watching this game. And so I went back and looked at their schedule. They don't have a lot of bad losses. If you go back, they started the season 1-3, and they lose at Chicago. That's a bad loss. And they lost to Portland at home. That's a terrible loss. So they started out with a couple of bad losses. They just lost on Tuesday at Brooklyn. You could maybe say that was a bad not a great loss. But outside of that, they're losing to the Bucks. They're losing to the Celtics. They're losing to the 76ers. Sort of the best teams in the Eastern Conference, the Orlando Magic. So I think sometimes, Legs, this early in the season, teams appear bad, but they just hit a tough patch of their schedule, and maybe they're a little bit better, and things will normalize. I have a suspicion that might be the case for Toronto. I don't know that as high on them as it sounds like you are, but I definitely think that they're a good, good, not great team, and their record shows that they're a little bit below that mark.
Yeah, look, I go and take a look at the parts that they have, and it's a good point about the schedule. They also, by the way, you point out, new coach, so
Yeah.
they're Darko Rajakovic. I hope I said it right. Rajakovic, I believe is how you pronounce it. I don't know much about his background, but he's new style, new system, new voice. All of that stuff maybe takes some time to sort through. Him figuring out what rotation he wants. So we give him a little bit of leeway there. I just look at the parts, and first I want to talk about Siakam because he's been one of my favorite players in the NBA. For the last probably half a dozen years. And I was thinking about this. If we were just to draft a team, you want to put together a team, an actual basketball team, not a group of stars, not an all-star team.
Right.
You want to go put together the best basketball team you can, and we take turns drafting guys in the entire league. I think I got a spot for Siakam on my team because a couple reasons. One, his motor's off the charts. The guy is just constantly coming at you. He's got a ton of energy. He's very versatile offensively, particularly, he's not a pure shooter, but certainly can make threes. And when he gets his feet set, he makes a couple. Now he's really dangerous because he puts it down well. He shoots the ball well, like off balance on these weird shots he shoots in the lane. He's a great slasher. He runs the floor well and handles it in the open floor. He's got such variety and versatility to his game, and he always competes on the other end of the floor. And you can switch him on to point guards. He can guard up to the 4 spot, maybe even the 5 spot in today's NBA. So I just looked at Siakam last night with his energy level, and I'm like, I want that guy on my team. Like I got a spot for Siakam. If you're going to tell me I just put together one basketball team, go win a game, I think I got a spot for him because of the number of ways I can utilize him. And you saw it last night. And the different guys, he's guarding Booker, he's guarding Durant. I mean, he's taking on these challenges the entire time. And then he's got this relentlessness on the other end where he just never stops moving. He puts so much pressure on you. So I start with him. He's been there a long time. He's been really good for a long time. He's been an all-star. And sometimes we forget about him when we think about some of the upper echelon players in this league. And I still think he's there.
So let's start with the defensive end, because I think this is a lot of what you're talking about. This team, I think, has a defensive identity, and they have a defensive path to being a great team. And that's kind of what you're getting at here with Siakam, who sort of embodies this. OG Anunoby and Scottie Barnes as this sort of lengthy, strong duo add so much length, next to Siakam. And they've got a bunch of guys that are like that even off of the bench. Boucher and Achua and Gary Trent has good size for a shooting guard. So they have all of these guys, and they can play on ball. As last night you saw Scottie Barnes, OG Anunoby, I thought did a great job on ball. And then you have all this length around them, so they have an identity. But that length then comes at an expense on the offensive end, because I think they're a very clunky offensive team. And they're only 12th in defense legs. And I haven't been able to go, like you, I haven't watched a ton of Raptors this year. But watching them last night, my thought was they're a better defensive team than 12th. I imagine they're in tough spots a lot because of how hard their offense is.
No, I think that's fair. I guess, it's not as pretty or as smooth maybe, and with as many complementary parts as you need, because there are a lot of similar type of guys. But I do think, I think the key to the whole thing ultimately is what is going to be the progression and ceiling for Scottie Barnes. He's so valued, and his name came up a few times in trade discussions when some of these big name superstars were potentially available, and Scottie Barnes was the guy that would get dangled, and there's no way the Raptors are parting with him. And you could see why. I mean, with a guy with that kind of size that can handle the ball like that, pass the ball, you can run your offense to him. He's got to improve his shooting and become more of a threat off the dribble from out there. And that's going to be, to me, what's going to ultimately determine how good this particular group can be. And I don't know that he's going to do that all in 1 year, but I think Scottie Barnes is the key to the whole thing. If he can add a little bit more range a little bit more of a threat from deeper where you can, because he runs ball screen a lot now. He runs ISO as the primary guy because he's such a good passer with great height. But now if you add the other element where, a guy can go under a pick and he can stop and shoot a three like elite level wings in this league do, now you've got a whole nother element to your offense. I think your point is fair. It's not necessarily the smoothest thing to watch, but there's something about them that it kind of just draws me to them with all of these guys that have, you put three of those guys side by side. I mean, they go fingertip to fingertip. They're touching the sidelines.
Right.
And so offensively, even on slashes, they're big targets. You saw plays last night where Phoenix, very important times in the game, did pretty good job with their initial defense. And then all you see are these hands going up and just tipping the ball and end up Scottie Barnes or Chua ends up grabbing it and putting it back in at the last second because there's a bounce and a length there that Phoenix just couldn't match with their guys. And I think so that even though it might not be as smooth as some of the top offenses in the league, I think there's more than enough there.
Interesting. Yeah, you're right that it's kind of almost this brutal style of offense and that a guy will go to the basket. It's not the prettiest drive and kind of throw it up a little robustly. And then there's all those arms and just tipping it and stuff. And they get buckets that way. I mean, the other way they get buckets is in transition. They're fifth in fast break points. Last night they had 20. And that was clearly like they need those points. Some teams, they get them and that's okay. It gets you going. It gets you momentum. I feel like Toronto needs those points. They don't generate a ton of steals, but they are quick in transition with their length. So when they get stops, they're able to get out on the break. Let's go back to Scottie Barnes, though, because he is the most interesting player, I think, on that team by a wide margin. Is there any player he reminds you of? Like, I always like asking you this about young players. Who should he be trying to become? Like, who are some of the various types of players you think he can steal from?
Man, that's a good one. I mean, you would think, and it's not necessarily somebody in the league right now coming to mind, but you think like a Scottie Pippen type of guy, right? That's the kind of player that I envision him being. Now, to do that, look, and Scottie always had the luxury, in those Chicago teams of not having to be the best offensive player on his team, as he had a pretty good one next to him, taking a lot of that pressure off him. And it's a little different for Scottie Barnes because I'm not sure in a given night who is their best offensive player. It kind of rotates around. A few guys. But I do think that's the profile. A bigger wing that can take it off the glass, handle the ball himself. Ultimately, I think to be, first of all, team success is elevated Scottie Pippen, right, to who he became.
Sure.
Now you view him differently. If that team's not winning championships, maybe you don't have Scottie Pippen quite as high a regard. Winning championships combined with his versatility of his game and his defensive prowess, I see Scottie Barnes as like that kind of guy. Similar length, similar defensive prowess and capability. He just has to become, because Scottie Pippen ended up being a big-time three-point threat, particularly in pressure situations. Scottie Pippen, in playoff career made threes. I mean, look at the list. He's in there. And you wouldn't think that. So you have to be able to add the consistency from that distance to your game. But I think that's the kind of guy that I would look at for Scottie Barnes to say that's the kind of impact that I want to have on a nightly basis. And I think he's got the physical tools to do it.
He's a really good athlete. I mean, he had a block yesterday where, I mean, he almost jumped too high on the block, came out of nowhere. And he's got that wingspan. I think they listed at 7'3" from the combine or whatever, but he's he's got a good athleticism and a great wingspan. So whenever we compare players, say, oh, he should be a Scottie Pippen, it's modern day Scottie Pippen. In the way the game has evolved, he has the talents to kind of be that. So I don't mind that comp at all. I do agree with you on his scoring, though. A jump shot, a more consistent, reliable jump shot. He is shooting 38% from three this year, which is a career high, albeit early in the season, and he's taking 5 a game. So the numbers are up there on his efficiency. But for him to teams are going to go under on him when he becomes the primary initiator and primary offensive option. The other guy who never gets talked about, they have a couple underrated guys on their roster. And one of the guys I know you like is Jakob Poeltl. This guy's a really good, quiet defensive player. He just does. He's a really good post defender in particular. And I know Nurkic went off and had a good game last night, but that was not through. Those were mostly through drop offs and different things. Jakob Poeltl, I think, is he's super long and he is a challenge. He's in that in between space where he's not an elite rim protector, but he's a really, really good one.
He does a lot of things well, and you might not notice it if you're just someone that's kind of casually browsing through box scores, right? You're going to skip over Jakob Poeltl's name a lot of nights. So therefore, when you sit down and watch a 48-minute game, the way I did last night, and you watch possession by possession, what he's doing, the activity, right? How smart he is defensively, with what he's seeing, and he's always in the right place at the right time. His, he's got soft hands. Now, when he goes to shoot a free throw, you could put a disclaimer at the bottom of the screen: viewer discretion is advised, because you don't want a young player watching that. Okay, because it's not pretty at the line. I get it. It's all palm and it's a straight dart. Okay, that's fine. Some big guys, they never quite get there from the line, but he's got soft hands. He had a couple of cuts last night where he slashed after one of their guys got in traffic. He slashed, caught it, and it wasn't like your basic little floater over the front of the rim. He had one where he caught it, took one more stride, and shot like a reverse layup with spin,
right,
and put English off the glass. A very difficult finish for a big guy. So he's got soft hands, soft touch. He's got great activity level. He's very good at understanding the pockets he needs to get to. When you're a big and you're down around the rim, you have to have a feel for, is my slip going to be into the center of the lane? Like if one of your wings is driving baseline, do I flash to the middle under the rim? That's the pocket. Or if a guy's driving from the slot down the lane, now you got to kind of get along the baseline behind that last defender and kind of hide back there, but make yourself available and anticipate it. He's really good at anticipating what space to fill up so that he can receive a pass and then finish it very simply. And basically, and like you said, he's active defensively. He bothers a lot of stuff. He's got his hands above his head all the time. He's never caught flat-footed. I admire him as a guy that's like a perfect center on a lot of teams, because a lot of centers in this league aren't going to touch the ball much offensively.
Right.
So what are you going to be willing to do for us to help us win and take advantage of the limited opportunities you get? Last night, I guess he was either 7 for 8 or 8 for 9. Just so efficient in his finishing. He only gets 7 shots a night, but he goes out there and he gives you 11 points. He's averaging 8 boards, 11 points a game on 26 minutes, man. And he's doing it super efficiently. So 73% from the field. So if he touches the ball and leaves the ground to shoot it, 73% of the time it's going in the basket. Can't ask for much more than that. I just was impressed watching him last night. And I think he's a guy I want to give a shout out to, because you're not going to notice him a lot of nights if you're not watching Raptors games.
The player who can be efficient in their touches but doesn't need any number of touches, can have 0 on any given night. It's underrated across the league. I mean, Jared Allen, I think, is one of these guys who just is like, he's content doing whatever role he needs, and if the ball finds him, he'll finish it at a high rate. But if it doesn't find him, he doesn't care. It doesn't make a difference.
I think Zubac from the Clippers is the guy I'd put in that category. Like, just more than serviceable. You can always rely on them. They're always going to play as hard, no matter what, no matter how many trips without touching the ball. They're going to screen dive over and over and over again. Even if they don't get it a bunch of times. And then when they finally do touch it, they finish it at an exceptionally high rate. That's a good one too. Allen's a good one to put in that category.
And it's interesting, your point about touch, because I think people think of touch as this monolithic thing: touch around the basket, touch in the mid-range, touch from the three. They really are all different. And there are players who have just this insane touch around the glass that can't shoot, and vice versa. Like Nurkic might be an opposite of this. Nurkic has a decent looking mid-range jumper. His form looks good. Around the basket, looks good, free throws. But then around the basket, the guy just flips it up. He has no touch at all. He has some of the ugliest misses. So those two skills are almost completely different, and we think of them as the same. Who else on this Toronto Raptors team do you find really interesting?
Precious Achiuwa really impressed me last night. And again, right into that mold, come in, great length, super high motor, was guarding everybody on the court, very active. And I thought he did a great job at times when he had to get onto a switch, or he had to provide the body in front of Booker or Durant. I thought he did a really nice job of affecting them and giving them something different in their field of vision. So he was a guy last night that I was super impressed with. Anunoby is a guy that I've kind of always liked, and I give him a lot of credit, because when he came out of Indiana, I didn't think he was going to ever become the type of three-point shooter that he has become. And he hit probably the biggest shot of the night last night, a left corner three.
Right in front of the bench.
Right. I think it was a 2-point game, and Phoenix had been trailing literally the entire game. They finally string together a couple stops. They get a couple buckets. It's a 2-point game, late, inside of 5 minutes for sure. And you could see the look of exasperation on Kevin Durant's face, because he was draped on Anunoby. And by the way, it was like one pass. It was like one pass up the floor into the corner. Yeah, it's a 2-point game, very important possession. And that by now, today's standards, it's considered an okay shot. It used to be, oh my God, what are you doing? Like, you got to get a good quality shot here. You're on the verge of losing this lead. He had no hesitation, went up. Durant draped on him, like palm on palm contest, and drains a three from the left corner. I did not think OG Anunoby would get to that level as a shooter in this league, and we know what his defensive prowess is. So those are two more guys. We talked about Siakam and Scottie Barnes, and we talked about Pirtle. These are two other guys that give him the length of versatility I'm talking about, and both played exceptionally well last night against a high-powered offensive team, and were difference makers.
So to my original point, defensively in today's NBA, overlap can be a great thing if it's wings with length, and they have a lot of those. But offensively, overlap can be a killer because you end up having guys that excel at the same things and struggle. And I think you might have that case with Siakam, OG, and Scottie Barnes. If you had to pick between any two of those players, factoring in everything, age and everything else, who would you pick if you had to pick two out of the three?
But who you just say? You said Anunoby, Barnes, and who's the third?
And Siakam. Yeah.
And Siakam. I'd take Siakam and Barnes.
Okay.
Pascal Siakam's, I know Anunoby's younger, and Siakam's been around a while. He's still only 29 years old. I mean, he's got another 5-6 years, I think, at playing at this type of level where he's in the discussion. Now, he might not be this year because, to make the reserve spot on the All-Star team, you've got to have enough team success. We'll see what happens with this team. I'm going to be shocked if at some point they don't string together some wins and get up into that mix, in that 4 through 6 spot. I would think the Raptors have to have that kind of run in them. If that's the case, he'll be in the discussion again, and I think he could be in discussion for the next 5 or 6 years. Scottie Barnes, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see 3-4 years from now. Are we looking at basically the same level of stat line? Which, by the way, nothing wrong with that. He's basically right now a 20, 10, and 6 guy, right? He's 19, 9, and 5.5. Okay, so you're talking about just slightly below 20, 10, and 6. All right, well, 20, 10, and 6, those are Hall of Fame numbers. You could do that for a career. So I'm not gonna say there's anything wrong with that. But at the same time, when you do that this early in your career and you're this young, well, then what's next? What's the next step for you? And that's what I'm going to be watching for him over the next few years. Now he might be top off at a 20-point scorer. Like, that's just who he is because he doesn't really think the game that way. I was thinking about this last night watching Zion, and I'm watching Zion Williamson, and I'm like, I don't know if Zion Williamson has the desire or the energy level to be a 30-point scorer. Because think about the guys we're talking about, the relentless nature of their attacking to get onto that level of a guy like a Jokic or an Embiid or a Curry or a Durant or a LeBron. It's nonstop. They're taking advantage of every opportunity they get, and they're willing to move a lot without the ball in the case of Curry. And I'm looking at Zion, kind of like, I don't know, man. Maybe he's content to be 23, shooting 60% from the field, but I feel like there's so much more energy there that he's not expending. And I don't know that it's an energy thing with Scottie Barnes. I think it might be the way he views the game and how he likes to play. So I don't know that he's going to be a guy that gets to 25 a night. He might not really want to, and maybe he doesn't need to if he's on the right team. You average 20, 10, and 6 on a team that's a contender, man, you might be an all-league player. So he's going to be the most fascinating guy for me on this roster to watch over the next few years. But, I think Siakam right now is the most surefire thing of what you're getting.
Right. There's no question. I do wonder if him and Barnes have the most overlap when we talk about the three guys. It's kind of an interesting question. I'm not really sure. But those three guys, I just like all three of them, and I'm not sure I like all three of them necessarily as like the three cornerstone pieces, which is what they would be. I think financially speaking, if you're committing to that team long term, those three guys are going to take up your first, second, and third payroll spots. And is that enough? Is that how you build your championship core? I would have my skepticism. Is there anything else you want to mention about the Raptors before we move on to Clippers?
I think that the one thing that's going to be difficult for them potentially to overcome is the role that Dennis Schroeder has. It's tough, and I understand that Siakam and Barnes touch the ball a lot early in the shot clock, and they're kind of like the guys that are the motor and decision makers. But they're not going to create a ton of pressure off ball screen and get downhill. And you look around the league, the teams that we talk about most nights that really have a shot, those are the kind of guys that they have. Guys that can get that ball screen, turn the corner, be downhill, and get into paint, and then make decisions out of that. Schroeder is at his best when he can just go hunt shots, because he's very, very difficult to guard with his speed and his start-stop, and he can string together buckets and get really hot and hurt you. But as a lead decision maker, that might be difficult for them, and maybe why they can't get into a category where we think they're as good as the Knicks, who have a Jalen Brunson running that spot, or the Bucks, who have a Lillard. And the Celtics don't. They have Drew Holiday. He's not necessarily that kind of player, but still, certainly, I think a little bit more of a table setter than a guy like Schroeder. So that's something that as much as I like some of these parts, especially defensively, the havoc that they are capable of causing, that's something that you got to look at with this team and wonder, is that going to be good enough at that spot for them to really get relevant?
And this is a team that needs to be set up. I think they take the third fewest shots that are unassisted, meaning almost all of their field goal attempts are assisted. They need somebody setting the table for them. And oftentimes, obviously, that's all of the guys that are driving and kicking, Scottie Barnes in particular. But so they're a team that needs that specific thing. Let's move on to the Clippers, though, because the Clippers suffered. We talked about this on Tuesday. What might have been their worst loss, or one of their worst losses of the year. They've had a handful of them, but a shorthanded Denver team that didn't have Murray, Jokic, or Aaron Gordon, they fall. DeAndre Jordan and Reggie Jackson outduel, their big four. But they bounced back last night, playing a Sacramento team who we're both very high on, who's been playing very well, and they bounced back in a big way. This game was not close. I mean, after this, there was a second quarter run that was like a 15-2 run or something like that. And after that, Sacramento never even made a counterpunch at any point in the game. What did you see from this one that stood out to you, and why were the Clippers able to bounce back?
Well, the biggest thing I saw was the best version of James Harden, since the Houston days. You might say the best version was James Harden averaging 35 points a game, running high ball screen and ISO every trip with the Rockets and leading the league in scoring and winning MVP. Okay, maybe you think that was the best version of him? Well, so. Since those days passed and he moved on and went to Brooklyn and Philly and now here, this is James Harden at his best. I thought that he picked his spots, but he looked aggressive and confident, and he had a little bit more of a burst early in the game. And he got rolling early, and I think he was the difference in their team. He goes 5 for 8 from the 3, 8 for 14 from the field. And he also was, making plays for people with his passing. He's still an elite level passer. But there are times when he is not feeling it offensively, when he becomes so predictable as a passer that he loses his effectiveness overall. He's got to have the right mix. And the nights he was really good in Philly in the regular season, that's what he looked like, what he did last night. And we haven't seen a whole lot of that because of everything that went down in Philly, and he hasn't done it this year, certainly. He looked like that last night. And those guys all looked comfortable. And I'm watching the game, and I'm saying, all right, I know because of the way that this team kind of came together and just everything about them, it's hard to go buy in, right? If you got 30 teams, 30 numbers on the roulette table, and one of those is the Clippers, you're probably not putting chips on that, or maybe you slide one chip over there, right? Just to cover yourself.
I just want to point out that every show you find a way to slight the Clippers, and I love it. It's
if their number, I got 30 logos on a roulette table. I'm going to always put a chip on there, right, to cover myself.
Okay.
Right? It's like because I'm a roulette guy. I'm a roulette guy at the casino. It's stupid because you can't win at roulette. But I always put at least $5 on the 0-0-0 split, right? Because that's going to hit, and it's so irritating when you've got all these numbers all over, and that hits, right? So I always put one there to protect myself because at worst case I get my money back on that bet, right? That's kind of how I feel about the Clippers. I'm going to keep a chip there.
The Clippers are the 0-0. Got it.
Yeah, Adam, when you watch him last night, you're going, go ahead, man. Dismiss this team at your own peril. I mean, look at the talent on this team. Yeah. And it's like, and when you have a night like that where Kawhi goes 14 for 18, and Paul George didn't have a particularly good shooting night, but 7 for 18 is not horrific. And then Harden's 8 for 14. And then those role players in the starting lineup, Zubac and Mann go 15 for 24 from the field combined. So you watch him last night against the team, by the way, in Sacramento, who, got everybody out there. They're playing, super fast. They couldn't stop them. They could not guard the Clippers at all last night. They never really made a run after they got down 20. And so I'm watching the Clippers and I'm just saying, man, you want to dismiss them because it's like, okay, enough with this team. You can't. You cannot dismiss what they are capable of doing on a given night. And last night was the best version we've seen since they put this together.
It was, but I'm going to play devil's advocate, and you're going to hate it because last night was Sacramento on the second night of a back-to-back. Now,
oh my God, back-to-back. Didn't we do one of these shows yesterday? We did on Reddit, right? So we're going back-to-back. No wonder I'm so tired. I knew I was exhausted for some reason.
we weren't. We did a show Tuesday. We're rested, man. But here's the thing. So, all right, all I'm saying is the Clippers to me are a team that is going to look like the best team in the world whenever the game is easy for them. If you're not making them run, if you're not making them feel you defensively, if you're not getting physical with them and making them earn it, they're going to look like the greatest team because this is a collection of guys that love pickup basketball, pickup style basketball, one-on-one. And in that run, that 15-2 run or whatever it was to close the first half at the end of the second quarter, the Kings were on their heels every possession. There was one play, Kawhi Leonard dribbles up the court and just stops and pops for three. Nobody checked him. Nobody picks him up. Nobody made him put the ball on the floor and attack. He just got to comfortably walk into it. And there were several plays like that, and they all made their shots. And I thought, this is the one thing you can't do against the Clippers. Let them feel like they're in an open gym because they are elite open gym players.
I think that's fair. It sounds almost like you're saying a little bit front runners. Like if they get off and they get comfortable, right? If they get comfortable, you got a problem on your hands. You got a real problem on your hands because of the elite talent level. But if you make them feel like, you know what, there's going to be an alley fight, and you're going to have to work for it a little bit, and that means you're going to have some ball reversals. You're going to have to, have multiple actions on the same set because we're not getting it off the initial action. I think that's a fair point. They just have such an array of elite level, tough shot makers. Now, that's not a way I want to run my offense every night, and I don't think that's a recipe for a championship. That's a tough way to win. But man, oh man, if you get this team, somebody's going to get this team in a best of 7. We assuming that they're not a play-in team and they get eliminated in a play-in. Assuming that it could happen. You're right. There's enough teams out west that you can make an argument for. Maybe that's exactly what happens to this team. You got to do a best of 7 though with this level of talent. I mean, imagine if that's your first round series. And you're a team like Denver or you're a team like Phoenix or Oklahoma City or Minnesota. Let's say like that last year, for instance, Sacramento. They're a 3 seed. Had this incredible year. We're talking about all season long. And your reward for that is Golden State. Right. And you get the Warriors. And you get Steph Curry. And you get a 50-point game 7 out of – that's what you got to deal with to overcome. So it's kind of the same here. Like one of these top teams, if Oklahoma City or Minnesota, because these other teams deal with injuries or whatever, and they end up in that top, in 2-3 seed or something, and you got to play a team like the Clippers in a best of 7, I mean, that's going to be a very difficult series for any of those younger teams that have ascended to get through, like Sacramento faced last year with Golden State. And that's all I'm saying. Like, you can't just say, forget the Clippers. They're the Clippers. They're not doing it. You can't do that with this level of talent.
Yeah. I love the comment from Steve Wynn. He says, Clippers are front runners until they are in front 3-1, which is a nice little dig there. All right, let's take a break. On the other side, we got to get into our Throwback Thursday topic where we look at the what made the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and maybe even 2020s. We'll try to project forward all of that on the other side. But first, NBA fans, the wait is over. Basketball is back, and DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NBA, is celebrating with an unbeatable offer. New customers can score $200 instantly in bonus bets for throwing down $5 on the NBA. Win or lose, it doesn't matter. You start the season with an instant dub. And with DraftKings parlays, you can throw down multiple bets and get even more return on your action. They even have the same game parlays where you can put them all down on the exact same game. So you can go Jokic triple-double, Michael Porter threes. You could go, what else happened last night for this Nuggets team? Jamal Murray assists. He had 6 of those things last night. You could have put all those things together. and you would have hit your bet. So basketball's more fun when you're in on the action. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use promo code ALLNBA. New customers can get $200 in bonus bets instantly for betting just $5. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook with code ALLNBA. The crown is yours. If you have a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY. That's 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort in Kansas, licensed partner Gold Nugget Lake Charles, Louisiana, 21 and older, age varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. See sportsbook.draftkings.com/basketball. Terms for eligibility and deposit restrictions, terms, and responsible gaming resources. All right, we are back for the second half now of the All-NBA show, and we got Throwback Thursday. Legs played in the 90s, grew up watching the 80s. I came up in the 90s, started watching the game in the 2010s really closely. So this is a good chance for us to go and look at all of these different decades and talk about how the game has evolved. And with the central question of what made basketball great in the decade. So let's start with the 80s. Legs, what made basketball great in the 1980s?
It's pretty simple. It's the Lakers Celtics. I mean, you think of the decade of the 80s, you think of that rivalry and just everything that went into that, where the league was at the start of the decade. And now you get Magic coming into the league. You get Bird coming into the league. These are two guys that, had this rivalry that was created in college, playing in the national championship game. It carries to the NBA. They go to storied franchises, both of which needed them at that time. And then they proceeded. It's funny because you would think that they played every year in the finals in the 80s. They didn't really do that. In fact, two of Boston's championships came against the Rockets. Right? So it wasn't every year, but it felt like that. And what made that awesome was the fact, I thought it was even better, the fact that you only saw them twice in the regular season. Right? So the hype around the two regular seasons was so big. And by the way, and look, we've talked enough about the load management. Everybody knows how I feel about that.
I was just about to bring it up.
One thing you could pretty much guarantee was those guys were going to play when you saw those games. No matter what they had going on, no matter what they were limping through or how they felt physically, there's no way they're missing those two matchups in the regular season, and then they would usually meet in the finals. But that rivalry and the memories created from those series and that are just etched in our minds. And in some cases, what both of those franchises went through in those given years to get there. Bird, for instance, against the Pistons with the steal he had late in that game. And, the Lakers, some of the stuff they had to go through just to get to the finals. And then these epic moments that will I know for me, as a guy that took up the game later in life, 1980, I'm going into high school. I was mainly a baseball player. Watching these two teams and Bird and Magic, and they became my two favorite players, which is weird to have two favorite players that are rivals on opposite teams. It's kind of strange, but it's because I loved their style. I loved their unselfishness. I loved their toughness. I loved the way both of those teams played. To me, was the essence of what basketball is supposed to look like. And so that, for me, you say 80s NBA, I just absolutely love that decade. It changed the course of my life watching at the NBA at the beginning of that decade and what those two teams look like. So for me, I think that's where you start when you start talking about that decade, is those two teams and the rivalry they created.
So I would say, and we had the same thing first down on our list here, I would say the rivalries. And the Lakers Celtics was the ultimate rivalry. But you throw the Pistons in there and their rivalry with the Bulls and Michael Jordan, their rivalry with the Celtics. And, it was a decade that was defined by 3 or 4 teams and their rivalries to each other in certain ways. And I think that's something, everybody talks about parity, the want for parity. And I'm one of these guys, somebody coming from Denver, a small market team. I want parity because it's the only chance my team has to really be great. But there is something to stories that unfolded over the course of a decade. The Magic Bird story took a decade to tell. it wasn't a thing that happened in 2 years and then we moved on
Right.
from it. It was every year you wondered what the new chapter was. And I think that there's something to that was really important and really good for basketball.
It was. And I think um, being a guy that ended up going to college in Philadelphia, fall of 1984, I get to Philly for the first time, right at the tail end of what I consider to be the most underrated team for a number of years in the league ever, and that's the Sixers. From 1980 to 1983, including the team that won it in 83 is one of the greatest teams of all time. You can start ranking top 10 teams of all time. They better have a place in there.
This one's Moses, Dr. J. Is Bobby Jones still on the team? Is
no Cheeks, Andrew Toney.
Okay.
Like Bobby Jones, like that group of guys. Moses was the difference maker. They went out and they got him. When he came in, it changed him from a really good team to a championship caliber team. But they went to 3 finals in 4 years. They only won 1. So as a result, they're not given their credit historically.
Right.
But look at the teams they had to get by. I mean, they lose to the Lakers, in the NBA Finals in 1980. They lose to the Lakers again in 1982. These are all-time great teams that they're losing to, and then they finally win it in 83. And by the way, who were they having to get through every year in the East? One of the all-time great teams in the 80 Celtics team. So they were third in the pecking order during that decade. And but because they only won 1 title, I feel like they're so far removed from Boston and the Lakers, and it's just not the case. They were a lot closer to those 2 teams than people give them credit for. And I think actually Moses Malone, to me, is the single most underrated player in the history of the NBA.
Really?
Yes. Because when you start talking about the fun games that you have at the bar, when you're talking about, pick teams, who's your center, and you start listing centers, Moses' name doesn't come up.
Never.
Right? You go Wilt, you go Russell, you go Shaq, you go Kareem, right? Those, and maybe Hakeem Olajuwon. You go those 5 guys. And then maybe depending on how many beers you got time for, you might get to Moses. But I'm telling you, if you're saying I got to go out there and play a 5-on-5 game, we pick anybody historically, and you're telling me I have to take Moses Malone as my center, I am perfectly fine with that. I'm perfectly fine with that.
So you're going to hate this because, again, this is before my time. But my impression of Moses is that his best weapon was offensive rebounding and that he had this sort of brutalist style of play that I've always wondered how much would his game translate. What else was to his game that makes you so confident that he was such a great player besides the rebounding?
It was more than that. When he got you on his back in the low post, he was immovable. He was as immovable practically as Shaq, even though he didn't have that kind of weight and mass. Right. Yeah. He had great hands. He had literally, it looked like he had glue on his fingertips. If he got one finger on a basketball in traffic, it was Moses's ball to be had. Yeah. The other thing, for a guy that big to go to the line and be as effective, he understood, like, I'm going to get so many opportunities here on a given night. I've got to turn myself into a big-time free throw shooter that my team can count on me, and they could. And I'll say one other thing about Moses. Every time he went to the foul line, there had to be, as soon as they ran to the other end of the floor, 3 different people that worked there, the ball boys, ball girls, had to run out and mop the foul line because he left
working hard.
He left a wading pool big enough for small children to play in of sweat at the foul line. He also, by the way, Adam, he'd grab a rebound, right? And if it got into his body at all, and then he threw that outlet pass, good luck catching that thing. It was the slickest object on the universe. Trying to catch the Moses Malone outlet pass. Like, you could see the beads of sweat flying off the ball as it was going to the guard for an outlet. So that's something else, an odd little tidbit about Moses that kind of stood out to me. But he just was such a workhorse in the paint, and he was relentless. And offensive rebounding. Of course, it's a joke now. If somebody misses a layup, sorry about that. Somebody misses a layup, and then they get their own miss. Oh, I did a Moses Malone there, intentionally missing to pad his stats. Moses Malone wasn't padding his stats, man. He was missing shots, and then he was just the first guy with the second jump to go get the ball. So I always thought he was one of the most relentless players that's played in this league, and I just don't think he gets enough credit when you talk about the all-time great centers.
Yeah. The other thing I had for the 80s here, the last one was pace of play. One reason why it was great. Now, this wasn't every team. I do laugh legs because the 80s, people always talk about, oh, back in the 80s, it was a physical league. It was a physical league. But there was a lot of successful teams that were not physical in that way, that were more finesse teams, fast break teams. Like the Denver Nuggets make it to the 1986 Western Conference Finals. That team didn't play any defense. They ran up and down the court. They were passing. They were like Showtime light, Showtime without the superstars. But you had the Lakers. You had a lot of teams that played fast breaking basketball in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing I also think about that era that made it great.
Another thing, and a real quick last point on this, and again, it gets back to the Celtics Lakers more than anything, but it was really the whole league. I don't know, man. In the 90s were kind of similar. That decade I played in. This was pre-review, so meaning that you're
so
review.
Yep.
So you physically, the rules that you had about preventing layups. And look, and I'm not saying it was necessarily a great thing to lay guys out, but what you did create out of some of those moments was an edge and an animosity and a genuine dislike for each other that I think is good in sports. And I don't know that we have a lot of that now. We have some, I guess you can call them rivalries, and it's more not really rivalries. It's more like, wow, this is a great matchup, and I love watching these two teams play each other. That's not the same thing as a rivalry. And some of the rivalry that we had in the league, and it wasn't just Celtics Lakers, was created because of what you were allowed to do physically to guys on drives. And look, in some cases, unfortunately, some guys got hurt, some guys bounced right back up, but it did create this level and this feeling of this is a war, and we're not giving up this stuff easily. And so you kind of circle your calendar for the next time those two teams were going to play, because you're on the edge of your seat, like wondering like what's about to happen tonight, because these guys genuinely, they didn't have social media. They weren't communicating with each other. They weren't watching each other's, they weren't watching each other's posts,
and they didn't necessarily grow up together. There's a whole other layer of this where nowadays these guys know each other since third grade or whatever. And back then they might not have met each other until they meet up on the NBA stage. So they don't have that familiarity. I thought you were going to say something different though with pace of play, or review, which is I am always blown away when I watch iconic old games and there's no timeouts at the end of the game. The end of the game, the clock just keeps going. Teams keep playing and the game ends. And something like the Jordan shot on Elo, you think about that when you think about today, there'd be 8 timeouts and you'd do this and you advance the ball in timeout and this, that game just happened. It just played out. And then there was the timeout and the shot and that was it.
100%. And look, are you one of those guys? Were you good with living with human error? When it comes to
right. I am.
Sometimes your team gets the benefit. Sometimes they didn't, but the ref had to call that in the moment. And you know what? And you weren't going to get, by the way, you might get a replay. You're not getting a replay from 8 angles in super slow-mo, right?
Yeah.
We're now, because the other night, the end of the, what game was that? I can't remember. It was this week, a couple nights ago. The last 2.5, 3 minutes of the game took like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Because of the number of reviews, and you got to go over and you got to get it right. I know some people feel like, well, if you have the capability, let's get it right. We want to be right. I don't know. The league seemed to be doing pretty well when we just were trusting referees, and sometimes you missed them, man, and sometimes you got them right. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it kind of probably balanced out for teams. Every fan of every team thinks they're always getting the short end of the stick.
That's so true.
Even now, I've got friends of teams that are so passionate about their teams, particularly the Philly teams, that even though the replays are showing that they got the call, insisting they still somehow got robbed. Yeah, that's just a fan mentality, and I get it. But I was okay living with human error in the game.
That gives you something to talk about. Let's move. We got to go quick here on now to the 90s. I think this one's almost simpler in some ways. What made the 90s great in basketball?
Michael Jordan, and it's really the second half of the decade and what the Bulls represented. And I can speak to it because I played against those teams, and I can just tell you, being an opposing player against those teams, home or away. So the away experience was the old Chicago Stadium. You were down at locker rooms. They went down these steps off the court. It was literally like light bulbs flickering in the hallway, like a concrete hallway, concrete floor. You go into there's puddles of water. Like you go into the locker room And I would compare it to like the scene in like Gladiator when Russell Crowe, they're back there and they're first getting ready to go out to battle. They're kind of looking through the little slats of light, like wondering like what are we thrusting ourselves into? It's kind of what it felt like playing them in that stadium. You go out there, you go through the lamps, and of course you do introductions. And by the time they got to Jordan and the iconic music was playing and they introduced Michael Jordan, literally I'd be shoulder to shoulder with a teammate, like on our bench, looking down at them at their starting lineup. You could not hear yourself communicate with the guy next to you. That's the environment that they created in Chicago Stadium and with what Michael Jordan did. And then at home, it felt different too, Adam, because at home, you're driving to a home game, but everything in the arena, the electricity in your building was so different. It was so different. It literally was like, the Beatles are coming in.
Yeah.
Like, that's what it felt like. And
I think the Warriors are only team that have come close to this. And it was a different scale, I know, with Jordan. But the Warriors in their heyday, it was similar, where you walked in and you're like, oh, this is a different game. Not just because the fans were there, but the buzz was there.
And we played the Bulls in the playoffs in 97 in the first round. It was best of 5. And we ended up getting swept 3-0. But all 3 of those games were still up in the air with 2 minutes to play. I mean, we took them right to the wire. And in fact, after the game, after the series, Jordan said we were the next up-and-coming team in the Eastern Conference because we had this incredibly young, talented front line. We had a lot of shooting. And then what happened was our front office decided to go ahead and trade everybody of value for some reason. And so that didn't pan out. But just knowing what that felt like, running out onto the court, because we played them 2 in Chicago, then 1 at home, that one home game and that playoff game, running out onto the court and watching our crowd, it was unlike anything I'd experienced for the electricity that the Bulls created being in your building for a playoff game. Yeah. So, and it's the funny thing is we talk about the decade of the 90s. It didn't start until the second half. They didn't win their first championship until 96. But then the Bulls.
They went in 91, 2, and 3.
Oh, no. I was thinking about the three-peat when I was in the league.
Okay,
when I was in the league, the second half, right. But so they win 6 and 8 years. They probably, I don't know if you agreed, I think they probably win 8 straight.
Man, I don't know.
If Jordan didn't go, and try to hit curveballs for, a couple of years. Yeah. I don't know if you agree with that, and I don't want to disrespect Houston, but, I mean, come on. Yeah. Why wouldn't they have?
Just fatigue. I think fatigue is a real thing when you're playing that much. You don't believe in fatigue, so I'm never going to convince you of this. You're a machine.
Well, listen, I got news for you. They were playing back-to-backs back then, and they were doing pretty well.
They were. Here's another thing about the 90s that I think is underappreciated. The synergy between the college game and the NBA game, I think in the 80s and 90s was important because the guys coming into the league that were stars in the 90s, most, not all, but most were stars at the college level. So there was this synergy between, I think there was probably less of a schism between a college basketball fan and an NBA fan because there was a continuity of sorts to it. It's like you graduated into the NBA. I think with the one and done rule and with the preps to pros and all this stuff that came in the decade after it, you lost a lot of that. But the 90s to me had a lot of guys who came into the league as known commodities because of their colleges, and there was just a synergy there. Do you agree with that?
I think that's a great point. I think it's a really good point. And that is a lot different than it feels like now. Most of the guys now you see that get into the league and have an impact right away. We're there for 1 year. Right. You don't have an identity with that player in that school really at all for the most part. Yeah. I saw a great note here by Steve Wynn. He makes a great note, and I think we should mention it. That's the other thing in the 90s, the Dream Team. All right, so the 92 Olympics, and I remember that team being put together, the greatest basketball team ever assembled. And for me, 88, we lose in the Olympics. So they make this decision. You know what we're going to do? We're going to go lay down the hammer. And they did. And I felt like that was the ultimate drop the mic message. Go back to the college guys. Who cares? Like, do you have to win that every? And by the way, if we don't win it, do we call it a national embarrassment? No, we immediately have excuses why we don't win it. Oh, well, international game is caught up, and well, you can't slap an all-star team together. Well, no, stop. If you're saying that it's critical to win, and you're sending all the best players, and you don't win, then let's call it a national embarrassment if you don't win. I felt like they sent the message. They were winning games by 40 and 50 points. They showed the world, this is what it looks like if we want to get serious about the Olympics and send the best basketball players in the world. They should have went back and given the honor back to the college guys after that. I would have had no problem with it, even if it meant they weren't winning the gold medal every year.
I liked pros, especially now. I like pros playing just because I do think the world is caught up. And so now I think even with the US giving their best punch, it's still in doubt to some degree. Real quickly on the 90s to wrap it up, I think that the media of the 90s in the NBA was also phenomenal. The NBA on NBC broadcasts are obviously iconic broadcasts. You had NBA Inside Stuff coming in, which is now we take for granted that type of media coverage, but that was revolutionary at the time. This like behind the scenes look at the NBA, and that's what helped grow the game. I think through that decade was you had these like human interest profiles and all the players. The players of the 90s, it was when they started to become celebrities at this new level. I think it exploded in the next decade in ways that maybe weren't great. Sports Illustrated, there were so many big media moments around the NBA in the 90s that I think is interesting. If we go to the 2000s, I'll start with this one. What made basketball great in the 2000s? The drama.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily sure it was great, but the soap opera of the NBA, the soap operification began in the 2000s really in earnest with Kobe and Shaq and some of the other. We talked about rivalries of the 80s teams. The 2000s were rivalries amongst themselves, perhaps, that added drama.
Yeah, look, we're talking about these teams that win in the decade. So we talk about Lakers, Celtics in the 80s. We talked about the Bulls in the 90s. And you look at the decade of the 2000s, from 2000 to 2009, 7 of those titles were won by 2 franchises, the Spurs and the Lakers. So the Lakers started it out with a three-peat, and then you had the Spurs, it seemed like winning every odd year. And then you capped it off at the end, 2009. The Lakers win another one. Then, of course, they win again in 2000, which would technically be the next decade. But it was really dominated by those 2 franchises more than anything else. And I think you go back to probably for me, it's going to be the Lakers teams, the dominance of those 2 players together at their peak. And I remember going down to those games in Philadelphia when they played the Sixers in the finals and watching what Shaq did to the defensive player of the year, Dikembe Mutombo, and the unstoppable force that he was. And just go back and look at Shaq's numbers through that 3-year run in the postseason. It's really, 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 anytime you start to question Shaq's ranking historically, just go look at that and what that meant. They had all these shooters around them, and it was the greatest show in the league. And you wonder what could have happened and what they could have accomplished if they didn't have sort of personal falling out that broke that up. Would they been able to win 4 or 5? We'll never know, because the dominance they showed over those 3, it certainly leaves you thinking that there could have been more.
The other thing about the 2000s to me, so we talked about the new media and all the different things. The NBA, the money of the NBA in the 2000s was different. In 1998, Michael Jordan, I think, made $30 million as a contract. The second highest paid player, I think, was $2 or $3 million. So the second highest paid player on a team was making $3 million. Fast forward to 2004, and all of a sudden the contracts are, you're talking about 18, 19-year-olds making 30, 40 million. Now we take it for granted because it's been 25 years of this, but that decade was the explosion of contracts where they went from a 1 or 2 million to all of a sudden 25, $30 million was normal to see. And I think that was also a sort of a defining trait. I don't know if that's what made it great, but it was certainly a defining trait. And then lastly, these got the pop culture icons. I think Allen Iverson, Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, these were guys that became more, even though Michael Jordan was obviously the first guy to transcend the sport, in the 2000s, you had a lot of guys that seemed to transcend the sport as the league. These guys became more than basketball players. They became pop culture icons more and more.
I agree with that. And I think the league has always been great about the individual marketing of the players. That's what's driven the league, going back to the Bird Magic days. It's franchises, yes, and it's team stories, yes, but it's the marketing of the individual players that the league has been so good at. And they continue to do that. And it's great to bring those guys up. Another show, we're going to have to get into the 2010s and the debate over whose decade is that, LeBron's or Steph's, and then also going from the 2020s that are now, we're just starting, we're a few years in. What's going to define this coming decade? I think that's going to be a great discussion. And who and what teams. And there's a lot of uncertainty and unknown there. We know a pretty good start with Jokic here at the start of the decade. But there's going to be other guys that are going to be in the mix here and other teams and franchises. So I think that's 2 decades that we can cover in a separate show.
And will we ever get to a point where no player defines the decade? The Adam Silver dream of true parity where nobody owns the decade the way we typically have in the NBA. Maybe not. I don't know. It'll be an interesting one. But Legs, I like Throwback Thursday.
Yeah, I do too, man. It's great to reminisce. And I think there's a lot of people out there based on the comments and the number of people checking in with us and giving us great feedback on what we're talking about. There's a lot of people that are hungry for this, man, because there's so many memories to be brought up. It's nostalgia for people.
For sure. Everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. We're going to round out the week tomorrow. There's some good games tonight. We haven't had the best games this week, to be honest with you, but we do have some good ones lined up for tonight. So tomorrow should make for a great show. Don't forget, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Spread the word. Help us grow this show, and hit that like button for us on the way out. We'll see you tomorrow.
All city like the mayor.